Okay, so in this video, I want to say it's dialogues, but it's really a drop-down strategy part two, probably more advanced drop-down strategy. In short, if you see my screen here, we're going to take this gallery and really focus on the dialogue that's needed that actually drives new elements to this gallery. We're not going to tackle the gallery in this video. That's coming up in the next video. So we're kind of working this a little bit backwards, but we're going to build our dialogue. But with these drop downs, there's something tricky going on here. And you will see this based on our entity model that we put together with all of these SharePoint lists with one-to-many, one-to-one, or many-to-many type relationships. And when it comes to drop downs and cascading type functionality, what it takes to really pull that off. I think that's the advanced feature. So maybe we'll call that video this: Advanced Drop-Down Strategies. Let's get started. Okay, so we're going to pick up right where we left off. So now we're going to just keep going to our next screen. So now we're on the vehicle screen. Now with the vehicles, we have a couple of things that's happening here, and I think we're going to tackle one of the two scenarios in this video. So in the first one, you have this gallery, right, of the different items, and then once you go next, this is the dialog to add one of those items to the gallery. So you see this option to add. Once you click on that, then that dialog pops up. We're actually going to start with the dialog in this video to where you have it popped up and then you can add items to that. Now, a lot of people don't really understand the best way to create dialogues. There is no dialogue component, right? So you almost have to get creative on how to build it. I've seen a lot of videos out there that kind of build it the hard way. And that's because for whatever reason, they're so adverse to using the form component. And I think this form component really saves you a ton of time. So here we are. That's what we're going to do. We're going to use a form component. We're going to illustrate or have this optical illusion of a dialogue. And then I think we'll go ahead and wrap. So this is going to be a pretty short video. So here we have our form component. And because, if you remember from the previous video, this was a copy of a previous screen. We just duplicated this, so we inherited a lot of this information. So I'm going to show you a couple of tricks on how to reuse a form component and where you need to plug in certain attributes. Maybe that's where people get tripped up. I'm not 100%, but we, as being super pros and really taking our skill set to a whole another level with maintenance, scalability, and ease of development and rapid development in mind, that's what we're going to focus on. Now, let me level set here because I'm not sure if it's been a while since we talked about this structure, right? So I'm not sure if you're really caught up on how we're laid out. So we have this clients list, and what we're building is a custom form off that list. And from that list, we have this client vehicles, and that's what's in this screen here. So for this particular client, these are all the Tesla vehicles that they have. So if we're fortunate like this client, we're going to have several of these, and this is where you kind of manage everything. And from there, so this client vehicle is going to have a one-to-many relationship to the client list. This is our main list. And then if you have a number of vehicles, that would be here. And also in client vehicles, this is what's going to make this thing a little bit tricky because you have the sales rep, right? And we know that for every vehicle, the rep selected is going to be limited to the dealership where this vehicle came from, right? So, I do have a dealer's list. So there's my dealerships. And this has the basic information. It's the location of the dealership, how many vehicles are on hand, how many reps are associated with it. But then you have this rep list that actually reference the dealership because each one of these reps must belong to one of these dealerships. And that's that relationship we have to carry on. And that's where things get a little bit tricky because we're going to have like 2 or 3 levels or 2 or 3 degrees of relational data using these SharePoint lists, and we kind of need to all have it come together as we're filling out this form. Okay, so with that, what we want to do is start with our client vehicles in order to populate this form, because whatever data we gather, though we have to get this data from several places, we want to save it into that client data list. So in order to do that, let's just bring in the client vehicle. So I'm going to go ahead and filter this down to SharePoint. I'm going to go ahead and click on my client's site, and then from here, go ahead and select my client vehicles, and then hit connect. So now that I have that client vehicles data source, I now go to the form component, change this data source. Again, this is me reusing a form component. So I'm going to change this to use the client vehicles as the data source. And now every time I fill that item out, I actually want to create a new item. So my SharePoint integration is out of context here, because my SharePoint integration is going to be tied to this client list, because again, this is where we are creating the client record. We're just using that one form based off of this list to add additional information, which is this one-to-many relational list. Okay, so here, because my SharePoint integration is out of context in this particular scenario, and in this scenario, I will always be adding a new item. I'm gonna just do defaults and then the name of the data source, and that's going to prime this form to create a new record. Now, I'm getting all these red X's here because none of these fields are part of the new data source. So now I need to go ahead and remove them. Okay, so now that I have this removed, what I want to do is add in these new fields now. So model, color, VIN, year, delivery, dealership, and sales rep. Now, the trick is I don't have all of these fields represented on that client vehicles list, right? So if you look at this client vehicle list, I'm going to have the VIN, the model, the color. Now watch out for the color, because the color is just a projected field off of my model, right? So if I look at my OEM vehicles, these are all my models, and I'm tied to each one of these. So if you look at that drop down, I'm gonna get a lot of duplicates here, but it's the color that makes them unique. Maybe the color and the generation combination that make these unique. So this is going to be very interesting how we pull this off, because in my client vehicles, I have a model drop down, but that model drop down is just looking at the various. So you can see here with that model drop down, I just have all these duplicates, and I really need the model and the color in order to make a unique selection. And that's going to be very interesting. So it'll be interesting to see how we pull that off. The other one is the year and the delivery date. So those are going to be, so the delivery date and the year are going to be native columns on the list. So those should be pretty straightforward. But then I get to another interesting scenario when I have dealership and sales reps. I want to, so watch what happens here. I want to store the sales rep, but I want to filter which reps I select based on the dealership. I'm not going to store the dealership on this list. It's really just the rep that I'm interested in, but I want to filter my capabilities before I store that rep. So I don't want them to select anyone in the organization. I now don't want them to select any rep from any dealership. I want to only limit the selections based on their dealership selecting. So almost look at that like a country state scenario. And again, this is a scenario that we solved in the past, but it's very interesting how we're just going to store one piece of this information, even though we use this to filter the piece that we want to store. Okay, so now that I'm back in Power Apps Studio, what I want to do is be very mindful on how I select these, because if I select them in the order I want them to appear, it would just save me a few keystrokes with moving the items up and down. Okay, so now I've made all of my selections. Most of the ones that I can select based on the information, and you would notice that I have some gaps. So I have model VIN, I skip color, and then year, delivery date, I skip dealership, and then I have the sales reps. Now the ones that I skipped are really just meant to really further my selection on what the information I need to save. So for example, the color of this model, in this drop down, I'm gonna have all my options for my model, but which one is selected, I want to trim that based on the color that I select for that model. And it's the combination of the model and the color, because this may be black, this may be gray, this may be blue. So if I select blue in the second drop down, then this is the Model 3 instance that I want to share. And it becomes very confusing because it's not clear that blue is an option. So in order to bring in the missing pieces, I want to use an empty data card to bring in those missing columns. So I want to bring in an empty data card to bring in color, as well as an empty data card to bring in for the dealership. So to do that, I just do edit, and let me just collapse so I can see everything, and then just add a card, and then add another card. And then once I have these cards here, I'm gonna just go ahead and drag them in position. So this first empty data card is gonna be the model color, and then the last data card is gonna be the dealership that I'm gonna use to filter my sales rep. Now that I have my data cards in place, I do want to go ahead and format the form in a sense where I have Van on the row by itself and then everyone else is sharing a row. So in order to do that, this is a trick that we used in the previous video, to where you just select your data card, double the width, and then that will force it to span across the row. And then for any empty spaces, just go to the nearest data card, touch it, and it will snap into place. Okay, so now I pretty much have my layout. Let's go ahead and start filling in the missing components. Now, in order to do this, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna copy some of these controls from a previous list, and then go to my data card and then paste that in. And now I have to do a few adjustments with the height and width in order to snap it back into the right location. And now what this label is doing, if I look at the text property, is looking at my parent display name. So because this was a custom data card, my display name on the data card is not set. So let's go ahead and set that. And now I have an error for the default selected value. So for this one, we're just gonna put in an empty string. And for my items, because I'm not reading any data from my drop-down selection from my SharePoint list, I can just use the sample. And notice for my default selected items, I just wrap the number 1 inside of brackets, and that's going to make it feel like it's a table value. And then lastly, what I'm going to do is modify my XY coordinates to position my drop down. And now with those few tweaks, my new drop down looks very similar to the out of the box drop down. So now I'm going to do something very similar to the dealership component custom data card, and I'm going to just select everything that I've done in this custom data card, copy it, and then paste it over to the new one. And then again, once I go to the data card, go to my display name, give it a unique name, modify my XY coordinates, and now everything should be right in position. Okay, so just like that. So to the naked eye, you can't tell which one of these are custom, which one of these are out of the box, and that's the way it should be. We can use these XY coordinates and then the width and the height to make sure that all of these are pixel perfect and they really reflect the out of the box data cards and related components. Okay, so now that we have this, what we want to do now is hydrate our drop down for color based on the selected model. And in order to do that, what I need to do now is bring in the other list that we have, which is going to be the OEM vehicles list. And that's going to bring in all of my options, and then I will filter it based on the selected model, and then that will limit the color choices based on that model. So here I just go to the data source, filter on SharePoint, go ahead and select my OEM vehicles, and now I'm going to select my color drop-down options based on my OEM vehicle list. Obviously, I don't want everything to come over, so I'm going to limit this. So now it's going to be a filter based on the selected model. So when I'm here, because I'm going to use this in the formula, I'm going to go ahead and rename this. And because it's a drop down, I prefix these with a DD and then give it a name that's relevant to the action that I'm working with. I was so tempted to call this DD models, but I know that I've used this in other screens and these names are global. So you will run into some naming collisions the more and more you use the same type of data across your various screens. So it's really good to come up with suffixes to really kind of help you make these unique for this particular scenario. So since we're dealing with client vehicles, that's the name I provided, DD model client vehicle. So now that I have that name, I can go ahead and apply my filter. And here in my filter, I'm filtering on where the model ID is equal to the selected model ID. No, actually, that's going to give me a unique item. I actually want to filter on the model name because my model name is going to give me all of the color options for that model. So in that scenario, I need to switch over to the value, which is what is displayed. And because this is a lookup, the ID would be the unique ID for each one of these records. And as soon as I do that, as you can see here, as I'm selecting the different models, my colors are being filtered based on the available colors within that model. Now, the one thing I do not like, and the users will appreciate this as well, is the fact that I have all of these duplicates, triplicates. So let's make these distinct, and because we do this, we're going to have to update our formula, which is fine. So the first thing we want to do is to get a distinct list of models. Okay, so to get the distinct, I just use the distinct function, and what happened is that choices is just a list of a value pair of ID and value, and it's the value that I want to make distinct. So when I filter this, or when I specify the distinct method, I specify which column within the choices table that I want to make distinct. Now, once you do that, distinct has this, it stores all the results into a column called results, and you always have to use this property in order to make to get access to this. So once you get that piece done, now you have to update your drop down. So you go to edit fields and make sure for your primary text and search field, you selected that results property. By default, it's going to be, before we convert it, it's going to be pointing to value, and you may get an error. So just update this to results, and then you should get a nice distinct list of all your models. Now, once we have that selected, we may have to update our model color to filter on, instead of .value, the selected .value, now we're going to have this property result. So as soon as we update that, everything else should respond and work as expected. Okay, so that's how you get a distinct list of choice options that you kind of get for free using a lookup column. And now I'm using that to drive the color selection based on that selected model. Now watch what happens. That's going to be very interesting. Now understand that this model data card came from our list, and our list is expecting a lookup value. So if you look at the data card and you go to the update property, this is what actually gets stored back into SharePoint. Now this doesn't make sense because SharePoint is expecting an ID value pair, and now we kind of distorted that with our distinct selector and dropped in this results piece. The other thing that's causing a problem for us is that this drop down had all the model Ys and the ID was kind of hidden. But in this scenario, the ID of which model Y that we want is based off this color. So in reality, it's actually the ID that's going to be from the second drop down is what we want to store into this data card. Now, this is going to be tricky because what's happening is where we have this one data card saving information, but the information is saved is going to be dependent on another data card or something that was in your cascade of the drop down, and that's the value that we need to store back. So now what we're going to do, because we're going to use this in the formula, let's go ahead and give it a name. I'm going to also name my data card. This is something I should have done right off the bat. Okay, so now I'm ready to update my save command. So now I selected the model data card that I'm saving back to the SharePoint list, go into the update. So instead of using DD model, I want to use DD model color. Okay, so now that I have DD model color, I need to tell it how to store what information I need to store back to the SharePoint list. So in this scenario, it's going to be a combination of the title, which is going to have the value, and then the ID property, which is going to have the actual ID. So this should be the format on how you save it. So basically, anytime that we do a curly bracket, that's going to be your record, and then all your property names would be the property name, colon, and then the value. If we were hard coding this, the ID would just be a number without double quotes for string, but the value would be wrapped into double quotes because it will be a string value. But since we're passing all of this as a variable, this is going to be the format. Now, we had to jump through some hoops in order to make this happen, but this should be saving as expected. So now let's go ahead and drop down to our dealership and state rep scenario. And basically in this scenario, what we have to do is get a list of all the dealerships and then filter the reps based off of the selected dealership. And again, this is just going to be a quick recap of the same steps that we did in the previous screen within this solution, and they're all going to follow the same format. So I have to get all of the dealerships that are available. So I'm going to do that by bringing in the dealership data source. Now that I have that selected, all I need to do now is update this drop down with all of my dealerships. Now, once I bring that in, you will notice that it's only displaying the cities. And I know from my dealerships, for example, I have a lot more other data points that I may want to display to give the user more information that they're selecting the correct one. Now, another thing to keep in mind with dealership, I am using the location column, which is really great for addresses because the location column, it brings in the street, city, state automatically, and it also has like a real-time map capability integrated, and was really, really handy. Thank goodness this is supported in Power Apps, so now I can be very selective on what parts of that location I want to display with my dealership. So let's go ahead and format our combo box, and let's use the double combo layout, and then the primary, I want to use the title because I think that's a little bit more descriptive on selecting the right dealership. Well, we renamed title to dealership, so let's select dealership. And then secondary, here you can see my location column. It has a colon, so there's a dot reference to the inner property. So now I can select the city to kind of help make that possible. Now, if I want the users to search, I don't want them searching on the city. That's not going to be helpful. I would rather have them search on the dealership. So I'm going to change the search field to dealership in that scenario. So now when I test this, I get the name of the dealership, and then I have the city as another data point to help me make sure I'm selecting the correct one. Okay, and then when it comes to rep, understand that rep is just going to be a people picker or a drop down or combo box that's tied to the people type field. And again, this is where we had to change our approach a bit. As we did with everything else, our knee-jerk reaction is to apply a filter here, but we saw in previous videos that does not work for whatever reason for the people picker drop down. So the workaround is to create this for all loop based on the change event, dump that information into a collection, and then set this to the sales rep drop down to that particular collection. So let's just make up a collection now. Let me unlock it. Okay. So here I'm going to just say rep client vehicles. And because I'm not setting or using anything with this collection, it's giving me a red squiggly initially. But once I start to apply my formula, then all of that will go away. So I'm selecting the dealership drop down using the change event. And here I'm going to just go ahead and put in my statements. Okay. So this is the basics of this formula. Again, I'm using this collection here. The first thing I want to do is clear it out because every time there's a change, I need to empty it out and rehydrate it. Here is going to be the sales rep. Right now, I don't have any logic. I'm really just putting in the core foundational pieces just to make sure it works. And let me just drop this to a new line. So for every rep, I'm going to collect into that collection the record, but only this property from that record, which is a people person type. And this is just going to build a collection of people, which works very great with this particular drop down on the people picker, but it's going to be filtered. So here, let me just make sure that this is working as expected. So I select my dealership. I see all the people, sales reps associated to that dealership. I'll select another dealership. Actually, my reps are fixed, right? Because I'm just showing everything. I'm not filtering by the dealership. So let's go ahead and start to filter this by the dealership. Now understand that my rep list is, again, this is just all repeat, but I'm taking this time here because I think if you get this concept, you're going to feel like you can build anything, because now you're learning different tips and tricks with cascading drop downs, using the selected or inner value of that drop down as the stored value, and using a lot of stair steps or tree traversing to get to a true value. And now in this scenario with the people picker, you're filtering the users that they can choose from versus allowing them to search anyone within the organization. And again, these are just very, very powerful tools that you can use in many different scenarios. So here in the sales rep, understand this one key point, that this dealership that I'm going to filter on is a lookup column to the dealership list. All of these have relationships, and if you want to see that in depth, I urge you to go back to the first video to where we lay out the schema, the entity diagrams, and what's a one-to-many, what's a one-to-one, so on and so forth. So definitely take a close look at that. So here we have the dealerships. That's going to be a lookup to this list, and that's important only because now when I do this filter, I'm going to be filtering based on an ID. I'm going to grab the dealership column from the sales rep list and then grab that ID, and that's going to be equal to the selected dealership from this dropdown. Again, I'm using this in a formula, so I want to name this. All right, so now that I have a nice name for this dropdown, let me go ahead and say with a dealership for client vehicle selected, and then that ID, and that should get me exactly what I'm looking for. So those are my Blue Ash reps in Cincinnati. So now if I select Columbus, Ethan is the only rep in Columbus. If I select Cleveland, Keelan's the only one in Cleveland. So this seems to be working as expected, and it seems like Oklahoma does not have any reps assigned. Okay, so now that we went through all of that to get and this was only complex because of the different relationships and understanding how to write the right expressions to filter these drop downs. Now we can get to our dialogue and making that feel like a dialogue box. Now, dialogues are very, very easy if you take the right approach to make them. So the first thing you want to do, and they're really just a series of rectangles. So the first thing I do, I love to grab a rectangle and just set it over the entire scale, the entire screen. And then what I do is set a transparency or the opacity level to one that's clear. So I like to choose a dark color, and then under custom, I set the transparency level to almost like a ghost. I can see I can tell something's in the back, but I can't interact with it. And that's the other thing. This rectangle covering it with that transparency will block all of the actions on that screen. That's why it sits right here on top. And then the next thing I want to do is let's go ahead and push our form forward. So let's go ahead and bring this forward. And with our form, we need to make sure that the background is white or whatever color you decide it to be, but at least, it feels like it sits on top of as like a dialogue. And then you want to grab your form and position that in the middle of the screen. And you're going to notice the gray the purple bounding boxes are guides that are letting you know when you're dead center. Now, once you have that, you need another rectangle that will serve like the inner rectangle for your form. And again, the form is always going to sit on top. So once I add that second one, I'm going to bring that on top. And to really make that second inner rectangle pop, I'm going to give it the same color as my form. And now things are really starting to shape up for me. I don't need all of this width and height. I can make these tight because really the only thing I need is a header to kind of show that it is a dialog, and then a couple of command buttons to kind of lock it in. So once I have this, everything else is really just adding in my other rectangles and buttons just to kind of make it feel like a dialog. And then I use my add icon. This is going to give me the X as we all used to with any type of window, especially Microsoft Windows. And here I'm going to go ahead and add a title for my dialog. And again, for my left padding, I just usually just default to a 20. And that usually gives me the space that's needed. And now if I zoom out, this is starting to look very good. And the last thing I need to do is add my save or cancel buttons here in the lower right hand corner. So to help me here, I'm gonna just go to a screen where I've already have these styled and branded, select them, copy them from that screen, go back to my dialog situation, paste them in, reposition them to where they're in the context of that dialog, and give them a new name. Okay, so in order to make all of this work, basically all you do is set a flag, and you set a global variable and give it a meaningful name so that way you can track all your dialogues and the variables that are managing the state for that dialog. So in this scenario, when you click the cancel button, let's just make this up. I'm going to set a variable. I'm going to call this the dialog client vehicle variable, and that's going to set that to false. And really, this is all you need. When I save it, I'm actually going to submit the form. Now, which form I'm going to submit? That's going to be my client vehicle form. Again, I normally rename these. I'm not on my game today. So in this scenario, I'm going to submit that form, and I understand that this is going to write to that one-to-many list, that client vehicle list, and it needs to capture some key information. So we're still going to have some work to do, but we can tackle that in the next video. At least we're setting up the foundation. So here we're going to submit the client vehicle form, and only if that's valid do we want to close the dialog, or else keep the user here in the dialog and force them to complete the invalid fields. Okay, so very simple if statement. If it's valid, go ahead and set the client vehicle to false. That's going to hide everything and really give you that feel like it's a dialog box. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we? Oh, here's one more. Let's prime the X icon. So if you click the X icon, or if you click cancel, or if you fill the information out and you save it, that will all close the dialog. Okay, so what do we mean by close? Basically, all we do is hide. Now, what we need to do is set the visibility property for each one of these elements or components to really just kind of make them disappear, and we will have another trigger that will make them all appear. But they need to do this in unison. So in order to do that, what I would do, I select them all, group them together, and really all of the group is, and I love giving these a name, right? So just call this group dialog. And really all the group does is not what we're used to like in PowerPoint, where we group and they all kind of write as a unit. I think they do that as well. But the most important thing, when you're setting the properties on the group, all it's going to do is copy that property down to every component in that group. It's really good to understand that it's just going to copy it down. So that way, if you had to break that, like say, for example, if I'm hiding this and for whatever reason I don't want the save to go with the hide, I can set the property on the group and then deep select into the save button and then set that visible property to something else. But in our scenario, all we're going to do is set set the visible property to whatever value is in that var dialog. And now what I can do, I can create a button to test this, and then probably keep this up in the header somewhere. And basically, I can make it a toggle. So I'm going to make this equal to, okay, seems like everything is not selected in my group. Who's missing? So it looks like I forgot the 2 rectangles that really define the background. So let me group these again. Now I have to give it another name. And now go back to the visible property and set it. So now, if everything's wired up correctly, I can hold down the Alt key, hit my button. You can see nice and neat. Hit the button again, it brings them back. And it really starts to feel like a dialog. And now I can hit cancel and click save. There's my validation, cancel, so on and so forth. So it really starts to feel like a dialog. Now, what you're seeing here, especially with the flicker, this is another scenario where I normally catch this, but every time you use a rectangle, make sure that your hover, your press, I would even say your disable are all set to the magic formula self fill. And what that would do is that whatever value you have in your fill color, that same value will be carried over to your hover and press. So that way, as your user mouses over these rectangles, you don't get that animation strobe effect, which can really kind of hurt the experience of your forms. So here I'm going to just go through each one of my rectangles that I'm using and set their value to this self.fill. And that's the beauty of this, is that it's the same value. It's the same formula value for each one of these, but they will work in unique ways based on their respective fill colors. Okay, so now that I have all of those set up, here I am, I'm moving my mouse around, all the flickering is gone. I can hit any one of these action buttons and they're going to do what we expect. This is not going to allow me to leave until I fill in the VIN. We probably have other information that we need to fill in, but this is a great start. So with all of that, we are set. We have our dialog set up. And again, if I flash over our wireframe, we're set up there. And now we will tackle in the next video this gallery and then wire up this add button, which will launch up our dialog. So again, it feels like we did this in the reverse order, and it's fine, it's okay. But you know, once we kind of get everything wired up, we'll make sure that our dialog form is saving the right information. There's no relationship currently right now. I don't even know if this thing is actually going to work, but I think we have all the key pieces in place. But the most valuable piece or critical piece that's missing is the item ID of this client being associated or related to each one of these vehicles. And that's another thing that we will have to tackle, especially for a new item. You will see in the next video when we get to that saving piece that there is some special considerations you have to consider, especially when you're saving related data to based on a master item and you're going through that new scenario. And these are things that can really trip you up, but I'm going to show you all the little tips and tricks and secrets that I've used in the past that really makes this straightforward and a reusable pattern. All right. Until then, I'll see you in the next video. Any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section, and I'll talk to you soon.